I think one of the persistent themes of American science fiction has been the rugged individualist who goes up against the system and either wins or loses. Heinlein is the classic example of this, the competent man out there. But I think it's still all the way through to William Gibson, to Case in Neuromancer. And I think this certainly derives directly from the myths that have shaped us of the frontier, the individual, the people who sailed away from England for religious freedom, the founding of the colonies.
But Nancy, William Gibson is a Canadian writer. He lives in British Columbia.
I don't know how much of American heroic myths and frontier myths are shared by Canadians. Like most Americans, I know a woefully small amount about Canadians, for which I apologize. I do know that Gibson's closest collaborator, Bruce Sterling, is Texan and could not possibly be more American. And I think that together they evolved a lot of the cyberpunk, I'm tempted to say theology, that informs a lot of Gibson's work.
Thanks, Nancy. Okay, we've heard from Americans about how science fiction is an American art form. Now let's hear from a European. Jean Giraud uses the pen name Moebius for his exotic science fiction comic books, which include Garden of Edena and The Incal. He lives in France, but he's collaborated with American comic writers like Stan Lee and Dan O'Bannon. Jean, it's Commander Rick. Is science fiction strictly an American art form?
I think science fiction is not absolutely American. It's English language form, because in England, the science fiction is very, very strong, too.
But your science fiction is very different from Star Trek. The worlds you create are fantastic, mythical. There's a surrealistic attitude, which I associate with the French or with European science fiction. Just the whole look of it, I don't know. Maybe I've just seen too many Fellini movies lately or something.
You know, I'm not speaking as French. I'm speaking as a modern Earth being, but I'm French. I cannot deny there are many French colors in my stories. But it's difficult to, I don't try to put it, or I don't try to take it off. You know, it comes like my accent or like anything. And if the people wants to see it, to watch it, they can. It's not a problem for me.
What about comics? Are they a European or an American art form?
In a way, it's American, because the American gave the form, you know, the modern form for comics. But if we forget the historical point of view, I think comics is a modern expression, period. And every country has his own genius and his own way to express that modernity.
Thanks, Jean. Au revoir. Well, we've heard what a comic book artist thinks about science fiction. Let's hear what a science fiction writer thinks about comic books. Harlan Ellison is a science fiction writer, music critic, political columnist, and occasional comic book writer.
Well, I love comic books. I think comic books, as I said in an article in Playboy, the comics are one of the 5 Native American art forms. The other 4 are the banjo music. The mystery story is created by Poe, musical comedy as we know it today, and another one which I can't think of right offhand. But it's like that. And the comic book is an art form that has existed now in this country for over 50 years, 60, 70 years. It is honored in other countries. In Japan, businessmen go to work with their attaché case with their computer and a manga comic book in it, or a manja, whatever, as it's pronounced there. In Italy, they have comic book festivals where they honor comic book artists.
The Europeans accord artists, comic book artists, a status that's far higher in the ladder than the status accorded them here, or up until now, certainly in America. One of the things that struck me when I first got to Europe in the early 60s was that I found myself invited into the company of painters, etchers, muralists, and people of that sort who didn't realize that I was dealing in what we call here a despised art form.
Comics were looked on as a junk medium, trash. When you're a kid, first thing your teachers always said was like, my teachers always said, get that joke book, you know, out of here, you know. Dennis, stop reading that comic book. You know, it's trash. Here, read this book instead if you're going to read anything. So I think in a way we kind of get that attitude reinforced to get to a point where a lot of the creators in comics think that way. Oh, it's trash until I can get something real, like, you know, I'm going to do Saturday Evening Post covers or something. I don't know why Americans have that attitude. But they have the same attitude toward jazz, you know, toward other Native American forms, you know, indigenous American art forms. Comics is one of them. You know, unfortunately, we tend to look down on the things that we create.
By the way, the one that I missed, the natural, you know, the Native American art forms, the fifth one was jazz, which I should have thought of first, but I'm going completely demented on you here, and it's okay.
There's an energy with comics right now that I think is only happening in like America and in England. It's not happening. It's happening other places, but it's not happening like it is here. There's an intensity from work that is about superheroes to work that is, I mean, super violent, to work that is super passionate, to work that is incredibly personal. You know, work like Love and Rockets and Yummy Fur.
You might not be familiar with Chester Brown's Yummy Fur. It's Canadian, it's not Archie and Jughead. It's like peering into someone's diary. Deceptively simple artwork, realistic dialogue, and the story, well, it's Chester's life. Yummy Fur is a real refreshing change from the superheroes and Ninja Turtles. I always feel like Chester isn't just putting out another issue, he's sharing something. In 1990, his peers awarded Yummy Fur 2 Harvey Awards, the comic book version of the Oscars. And no, Chester didn't say, "You like me, you really like me." Chester, it's Commander Rick. Does Canada show up in your work?
Well, since my work is autobiographical and since I live in Canada, Canada's going to end up in my comics somehow.
And how does it end up in your comics?
As background. If I'm going to do a story about my childhood, then it'll be set where I grew up, which is in Chateauguay, just outside Montreal. If I'm doing stories set now, I'd be doing stuff that's set in Toronto.
What do Canadian readers get out of your stories?
They recognize the way they felt when they were 15 years old and, and worried about buying Playboy and that people would find out that they were looking at pictures of naked women.
But that's universal. Someone living in Texas or London, England would get that out of Yummy Fur. Thanks, Chester. I guess the question is, does setting a story in Canada make it Canadian? I mean, does the fact that Wolverine is a Canadian make his comic adventures an exploration of the two solitudes? Or just because Alpha Flight is set in Canada, is it the true voice of the true North, considering it's written and drawn by Americans? Or how about the Amazing Spider-Man anti-drug issue that's set in Winnipeg, again written and drawn by Americans, but featuring Canadian landmarks like the Winnipeg Mall, which doesn't exist? In comics, the Canadian voice is awfully soft. In science fiction, there is a definite Canadian voice on spec. This Alberta-based magazine publishes Canadian writers almost exclusively. Marianne, it's Commander Rick. Is there a Canadian voice in science fiction, or a Canadian style, a Canadian theme?